This video is about a very large mistake that I believe Capcom are making. It is going to be bad for the game. It is going to be bad for gaming in general. It sets a precedent that I've not seen set in gaming yet. Someone else might have done it, but this is the first, really monstrously big deal. See what I did there? Monstrously big deal game that is doing it, and I think it's very, very dangerous for gaming, and it is going to result in worse experiences for gamers. Hello again, I am Blunty. Take a big sip of coffee. Because I haven't decided what I'm going to title this video yet, but it's probably going to be something pretty negatively inflected, a little bit aggressive, about a game series that is beloved. And I mean beloved by me. I love Monster Hunter. If you gave me the choice between a new game in the Monster Hunter series and a new game in pretty much any other series from any other publisher in the history of gaming, I'd choose Monster Hunter. It's a guarantee that I will have fun. So please believe me when I tell you the very last thing I want to do is poop on Monster Hunter here. I don't want to be the guy just making, negative videos for the sake of getting hate clicks. Now then, let's get to the actual point, shall we? Coffee done. So we had PlayStation State of Play yesterday, about 24 hours from when I'm recording this, because I want to digest as much as possible from it, especially when it comes to the Monster Hunter stuff. And we got an awesome new trailer, just some of which you're seeing on the website right there, but just epic new trailer. And we finally got a release date. A date, by the way, I was very accurate in predicting, only about 4 weeks off when I made my video about predicting the release date, and I went through all my calculations and reasoning and everything. I was very, very, very close, so I want a thumbs up in the down below for that. But this is the screen that concerns me. I was whining just the other day on Twitter, or X or whatever. I forget what game it was. Some new game coming out, and they released the recommended specs. And on those recommended specs, they did not once mention what resolution they were targeting, what frame rate they were targeting. So the recommended specs are meaningless to try and work out how the game is going to actually run. It's just like, well, these are the minimum specs you need for the game to run at all. They don't even tell you how well it's going to run. Are you targeting 20 frames at 720p or 60 frames at 4K? Who knows? Very annoying, but Capcom are really generally very good about this, and they have been good about this time. They're telling us exactly what they're targeting with their specs, and that's the problem. So, minimum specs first. Let's run through these a little bit. They're targeting 1080p resolution, but it's upscaled. Not terribly surprising in this day and age. The upscaling technology is quite good, and you can get away with quite a lot. But it's nice they're actually telling us about that, because there have been other game companies who've done this and haven't mentioned that the 1080p they mentioned in the minimum specs is upscaled. So we're coming up from 720p, which you can see down here, 720p native. So at minimum specs, coming up from 720p upscaled to 1080p, it's probably going to look okay. If you've got a very low level machine or a very old machine you're hopping around this on, you'll be able to run it pretty fine, but don't expect too much. And that's hardly surprised. So we're targeting 30 FPS, which not ideal for Monster Hunter. It can work perfectly fine. The Switch version of Rise, where that game was designed from the ground up to be a 30 FPS game and then ported later to other things, it was fine at 30 FPS. I am generally a bit sensitive to frame rate as a gamer of 4 decades. But in Rise's case, it felt fine. However, once it got ported to the other systems, to the consoles and the PC, and I played it at 60 FPS, it felt way better. Like the fluidity of it felt so much better. It didn't make it hard or impossible to go back to the Switch version when I did that, but it did feel jarring for about the first 20 minutes when I went back to 30 FPS on the Switch. So yeah, Monster Hunter can work at 30 FPS, but it's much better at 60. You really do want to target 60. But again, we're talking about minimum specs, so you get what you get. One issue that might come along for low spec gamers is the 140 gigabyte install size. Woo! Wasn't expecting that from this game. I mean, there are some games that are getting very, very bloated these days. Wasn't quite expecting 140 gigabytes for Wilds. And keep this in mind too. It is a Monster Hunter game, So sooner or later, year or two down the road, we are going to get the Master Rank expansion. So, World had Iceborne and Rise had Sunbreak, which will probably add another 50 to 80% along to that install size, maybe even double it, who knows. So keep that in mind. You're going to need lots of spare space. 140 gigabyte shouldn't be a big deal for most gamers these days, but if we're talking about the low spec gamers, that could be definitely an issue. Then again, if I was low spec gaming, I had to make the choice about uninstalling 2 or 3 other games to install this game. That's an easy decision. Now then, let's talk about recommended specs. This is where things get complicated, and not in a good way. So, targeting resolution for recommended specs, 1080p still. That's weird. That's weird. Recommended specs, I mean, you're talking about, this is the recommendation about how you should be playing a game. That should be 4K in this day and age. I mean, most gamers are on 1440p, but still, your top-end spec, you should be targeting 4K. But we're looking at 1080p here. But it gets worse. The frame rate we're targeting 60 FPS, yay, but with frame generation enabled. That is a really, really, really bad idea. And for a little while now, we've seen people saber rattling about this issue, about frame generation, about fake frames in their games, and developers using it as a crutch to claim higher performance. And we haven't really seen many developers lean on it too heavily until now. Upscaling, sure, but the frame generation stuff, not so much. Here's why it's a problem. 60 FPS with frame generation. If it was 120 FPS with frame generation, no problem, because then you're still running at base 60, which means it feels fluid, all right? The frame rate thing for action RPG games, like Monster Hunter in particular, or first-person shooters, any high-action game, it is not just about how fluid it looks on screen. With frame generation from 30 FPS real frames to 60 FPS presented frames, it might look smoother on screen. If you pan across the scene, it won't jitter quite as much, but it won't feel like you're playing a 60 FPS game, because that's not how it works. It's going to feel worse than 30, because you're playing at 30 FPS, essentially, and there is extra latency happening, because every frame it generates, that CPU has to do a little thinking. Okay, let's look at this frame, let's look at this frame, let's figure out what the frame in the middle should be, and it spits it out, and that adds latency. And again, when you're talking about upscaling from 60 to 120 or even further, that's not really a huge problem for most games. If you're already talking about the input latency you get at 30 FPS, and you're adding on to that with frame generation, not only is it going to not feel like 30 FPS anymore, it's going to feel worse than 30 FPS. And in a game like this, where input timing is absolute key, that is a really, really, really bad idea. Now, it doesn't matter whose frame generation you're talking about. In this case, I'm going to assume it's probably AMD or possibly Intel's frame generation, which in some ways is better than AMD's, in other ways not. It's a per game kind of choice between those two. It's also possible to be NVIDIA's, which is the superior one, but not everyone has access to that because, well, you need an NVIDIA card for that, where the other two are hardware agnostic. But it doesn't matter which one you pick, because they all come with the recommendation, and AMD is very, very vocal about this in particular. Frame generation is not intended to run a 30 FPS game at 60. That's just not what it's for, because of the issues I was talking about. AMD know those issues. They developed the technology. They know it doesn't feel right upscaling from 30 to 60. What frame generation is for, well, worst case scenario, smoothing out at the top end. So if you're running at 45, 50 FPS, you can use frame generation to pad that out and then sort of cap back to 60 if you like, or just let it free run. That feels pretty good, but the way it presents on screen is noticeably nicer in many cases. So for Capcom to do this on their recommended specs, saying the only way you're going to get 60 with these specs is if you use frame generation against the advice of the people who invented the technology to do the frame generation. Horrible, horrible idea. You don't get to say your game runs at 60 FPS if you're using frame generation to get to 60. You just don't. And this is what people are scared of. Developers starting to do this more and more often, because it does not feel like 60 FPS when you play. And that's what we want. 60 FPS. We want the fluidity feeling of 60. That's why we want it there. We don't care that it looks smoother on screen when you turn the camera, or there's less juddering, in animation. That's not what it's about when we're talking about high frame rates. It's about how it feels. I'm sure you've all heard, people say they can't tell the difference by looking at it. If you look at a video of 30 FPS versus 60 FPS gameplay, some people say, oh, I can't tell the difference. Try it. Try playing your games like that. Pick your favorite high action game, go into the settings, frame lock it to 30. Play it for 10 minutes, then frame lock it to 60 and play it for 10 minutes. And you tell me you don't feel the difference. So let's move down the list. When we're talking about CPUs, still pretty reasonable requirements for this day and age. We're looking at a Ryzen 5 3600X or a 5500 or a 12400. These are pretty decent, gaming CPUs that I feel pretty safe in saying that most enthusiast PC gamers, people who game on the PC regularly, will be somewhere in this ballpark pretty easily. And again, it's an indication that we're not dealing with a particularly intensive or a particularly CPU intensive game. It's running on the same basic game engine as Dragon's Dogma, and a lot of people have bought that up saying, oh, Dragon's Dogma runs shit on PC, blah, 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 blah. And they're worried about how Wilds is going to perform. But the thing most people who I've heard talk about this haven't seemed to pick up on is the biggest issue with Dragon's Dogma is the way it was handling its many, many, many NPCs. This is an issue that Wilds doesn't have. Wilds has a very small fistful of NPCs that are active on the field at any one time, maybe 2 or 3, probably 5 at the max. So if you're hunting alone, you get 3 assistant hunters and your handler. Whereas Dragon's Dogma had many, many, many dozens of NPCs, all doing their own little thing to give you a very alive feeling world, and that was the CPU bottleneck in that game. This is an issue we've known about since the issue came to light, and that's why we're seeing here relatively lower CPU recommendations, and I don't think that's going to be an issue with this game when it comes to CPU capping. When we're talking about memory, again, 16 gigabytes, pretty damn normal for gaming rigs these days. Graphics-wise, we start at 2070 Super, which is pretty reasonable, 4060 or 6700 XT. Now, the thing is, you would expect 1080p 60 native pretty easily on most modern games, right? Maybe even 1440 60, depending on the game. But with these CPUs only doing actually 30 and relying on frame generation to get to 60, that's a bit of a warning sign about how this game performs. VRAM, we're talking about 8 gigabytes, which, again, pretty normal for these cards. I don't think any of these cards are available or anything less anyway. Does the 4060 come to 6 gigabyte one? I forget. Probably not, right? Who would be that stupid? And storage, of course, is the same. SSD required, and again, for a big open field, visually complicated game like this game is, that's hardly a surprise. And again, in this day and age, if you are an enthusiast gamer and you don't already have an SSD for your game library, you're hitting a lot of issues with a lot of games for a couple of years now at least. So there's nothing we need to worry about too much there. But if you didn't notice already, in all my ranting about frame generation and recommended specs and GPUs, we're talking medium settings. So we're talking 4060 running at 1080p, 30 FPS at medium settings. This game is going to be a pig, an absolute pig for GPU stuff. And I'm not sure what to make of that. We have no hint here about whether or not ray tracing is going to be in the game. It hasn't been in any... Has any Capcom game done ray tracing? I don't know. I'm most familiar with Monster Hunter. I know Monster Hunter never have done it. I wish they did. Because, in the ice caverns and in big lava caves and stuff, ray tracing would look epic in those locations. So I really want them to do ray tracing, but if this is what we're using, to get to medium settings, 30 FPS native, I don't think we're likely to get any serious graphical options here when it comes to ray tracing and all the fancier stuff. It also makes me wonder, like the footage we've seen so far is being mostly console footage. Like when they've shown it off in live gameplay at places like Gamescom and you know, the other couple of places have shown it off since then, PAX West and whatnot, it's the PlayStation version of the game. We don't know for sure what mode that was in. Presumably they'll do what most developers do and have, you know, a performance mode and a presentation mode where it's, you know, either pretty or it runs well, because asking for both at the same time on a console is too much. But it looks pretty good on console. Is what we're seeing on console these 1080p, probably upscaled because PlayStation does, you know, its own upscaling. Is it running at 1080p native? Is it running on what we would consider medium settings when we get to the PC version? Is the game actually going to look better on PC if you have the hardware to do it? Or is the optimization on console, that's what we're going to get in high settings on PC? There are a lot of questions here I need answers to. And that's one of the reasons I hope we get a demo sooner rather than later, so we can actually start playing with these settings. Now, the demos are never going to be truly representative because they are based on earlier code than what we'll see at release. And we saw this with the PC release of Rise. The demo performed worse than the final game did, especially with this day one patch. But it will give us a better ballpark about what we're dealing with here, which settings are going to make the biggest effect, and we can start sort of making decisions and choices based around that. But what I'm seeing here are huge red flags that people have been, and you know, I to this point, I've been, you're exaggerating. No developer's going to be stupid enough to do that. But turns out I was a little too optimistic on that, which is unusual for me. But yeah, medium settings, 30 FPS native, frame gen to 60 to feel really crappy at only 1080p on their recommended specs for PC. These are huge, big, flashing neon warning signs that this game is going to be an absolute pig to run. That said, we also have to remember that Monster Hunter World, when it came out on PC, which was a few months after the console release, you know, on the PlayStation 4 and Xbox, it had severe performance issues. Like when Digital Foundry did the original video on the console version of Monster Hunter World when it first came out, we're talking the PlayStation was dropping down to 25 FPS, 24 FPS at times, and it was just couldn't even get to 30 stably in a lot of places. They did eventually patch the game and fix it up and optimize it so it does run decently well now. But then when it came out on PC, a lot of people found out that it was also a rather big pig to run. And in fact, because it was a pig to run, I used to use it as a benchmarking tool because it was one of the tougher games to run. So it was a really good tool for saying, oh, well, I'm reviewing this GPU now. How does it run Monster Hunter World? So I'm not terribly surprised to find out that Wilds is going to be kind of aggressive when it comes to your GPU, especially, it seems. I am, however, a bit disappointed because between World and Rise and their expansions, Monster Hunter has a higher profile now than it ever has done in the history of gaming. And we just saw that yesterday. Within the first 10 hours of announcing that it was available for pre-order, we don't know how it's doing on consoles, but on Steam at least, it jumped immediately to the #1 selling game, based on, you know, how much dollars it's bringing in, globally. Just like that. A lot of people are really excited about this. So you want as many people as possible to have a good to great experience running the game. And when we're talking about having a good to great experience running a Monster Hunter game, you don't want to be targeting 30 FPS and you don't want to be targeting medium settings. No, not at recommended specs. Recommended specs should be absolute minimum 1440p, 60 FPS, native on both accounts. No upscaling, no frame generation, just raw. But yeah, we're entering an era where frame gen and upscaling are becoming part and parcel of how developers are representing their games as far as what specs you need to run them recommended. Not just absolute minimum. They're not just stopgaps to lower the minimum as low as possible so as many people can play it as possible, you know, just using these to fill the gaps. But at the top end, when you're still using these to represent your game, not good enough. Absolutely not good enough. Now, what else is not good enough? Monster Hunter Wilds Steam page. If we scroll down, oh, look at that. Denuvo anti-tamper. Well known for making games run worse. Hey, if you're having so many issues making your game run that you're targeting 1080p 30 FPS on your recommended settings, maybe don't use Denuvo. It makes the situation worse. We all know this. It has been demonstrated again and again and again and again by dozens of tech tubers in dozens of different ways for years now. We know this makes games run worse. Also, for the first time that I've seen, with a Monster Hunter game at least, they're doing an activation limit. Only 5 PCs. I mean, 5 is more than enough for most people, but if you're someone out there trying to do a bunch of testing on different machines, when you're talking about performance and you're going, well, how does it perform on this machine? How does it perform on my low spec machine? That might be a bit of a pain in the ass for some of us. But obviously low priority to a regular person gamer type thing. 5 is probably enough for me, frankly, if I'm doing that kind of testing, but still kind of annoying to have this limit at all. What point is that? How does it help anybody? Good news is Capcom often only use Denuvo for a little while and eventually get rid of it. So if we go to Monster Hunter Rise here, that launched with Denuvo. It is now gone. However, they have replaced it with the Enigma DRM, which I don't know much about Enigma. It's not as bad as Denuvo when it comes to performance, apparently, but it's still there. If we go to Monster Hunter World, we can see that it launched with Denuvo, which again was part of the problem, but they eventually took it away. So once they sell a certain number, and they've tricked themselves into thinking they're protecting themselves against piracy, which they're not, because name a game where Denuvo hasn't been cracked within 3 days. I dare you. No? Can't do it? Yeah, can't do it. Denuvo is pointless. It makes the game worse for paying customers, and it does not stop piracy. It just doesn't. The bean counters are in charge when it comes to this sort of stuff, I suppose. But they eventually get rid of it, which makes the game run better and doesn't change anything about piracy. Capcom really disappointing me about some of the choices they're making in this game. I desperately want to do nothing but glaze unapologetically for the next 150 odd days until it releases, and then probably continue glazing it. But obviously at some point after launch, or maybe just before launch, if I'm lucky enough to get a review code or something, and then I'll make videos about the performance issues, because it will have performance issues. That's just a fact at this point. We know it. We can tell because this tells us it's going to have performance issues. Thanks for watching. I am Blunty. I'll catch you next time. Thank you as always to the patrons scrolling up above there. And yeah, with a bit of luck, this will be one of the very few negatively inflected videos I make about this game, because, you know, I don't like being negative, but there's no avoiding it this time. This is a very bad thing.